So for those of you joining us on YouTube, wanted to say Shabbat Shalom and welcome. And we will get started here in a moment. Okay, so past couple of weeks, we have been discussing the wilderness season and the season of fatness. And we have been basically kind of exploring the various nuances of the parasha. So because we have new people, I'm going to go ahead and give some basic explanations, but basically short version is that Ezra broke the first 5 books of the Bible up into readable portions for each week. And of course, we see that in Acts chapter 15, verse 21. It says, for Moses is read in the synagogues, is preached in the synagogues every Sabbath from ancient times. And of course, the ancient times would be during Ezra's time, and he had it set up to where you could actually read through the Torah portion that was allotted for that week over a 7-day period. And he had them read it in the marketplace, except on the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, he taught from it. Okay, so there's a few reasons why this is important. The first one is obviously for those who are not familiar with the Torah scroll, it's broken up into sections and throughout the world, a rabbi can offer his Torah scroll as an inspection to the chief rabbi, and he can check and see if the scroll is in the right spot. We weren't able to get that camera running today, so we will definitely work on getting that fixed, but that our Torah scroll is compliant. It's in line with the rest of the world as far as where our scroll is. And of course, there's been times where people have been asked to show their Torah scroll to authenticate that they're the sons of Israel. So that's been an interesting journey to maintain the scroll and to keep it in function. So anyways, a parasha is a Torah scroll portion, okay? The reason why this is important is because in the parasha this week, there are some very interesting things going on. Now, I can tell you, I don't prepare my messages. What do I mean by that? I don't sit down and double check and come up with a list of scriptures and key talking points. Usually what happens is the Father will ask me a question sometime during the week, and I will meditate on it. And then a confirmation will come, and then another confirmation will come, and I'll know I have my message. I will have no idea what I'm going to say. I have no idea how it's going to go. And so that way the Father has an opportunity to teach us and for me to speak. There's a couple of reasons why this is important to me. And number one is because I want to be out of the way. I don't want to be a hindrance to the Word of God. Second reason is because I don't really see anybody else doing that. And so I feel like maybe I'm change that this world needs. The reason I bring this up is because when I understand something about the parasha, because I've studied the parasha so many times, and I have a question come up in my head, and then I realize, oh wait, that's the parasha we're in, things get heavy. But I can tell you that the confirmations come where somebody who does not know that God asked me that question will go, hey, this question. And I'll go, there's the question. God asked me the question. Now this person's asking me the question. That's not a coincidence. And then this thing over here happens, and I am, I get the question asked over here. And so then I have my two witnesses, and that's usually enough. After His Heart Ministry incorporated on December 2nd of 2020. December 27th of 2020, we were kicked out of the church that we had had an opportunity to use, and I ended up in my bedroom on my iPad on Zoom. We had 3-4 people who were actually listening in on Zoom. At that time, I began wondering if we were even going to be staying open as a ministry. In fact, there was a part of me that wondered if we got kicked out of the church because God didn't want us to have a ministry. I can tell you, in the history of After His Heart Ministries, I have never experienced the level of confirmation on a message in this week. So I would pray that you would open your hearts, open your ears, open your eyes to see, because we're going to be diagramming, and change your bias. Because I think what we are used to is going to be based upon years and years of Christian tradition that may or may not match up with the way in which God deals with His people. So having said that, we'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing I would like to talk about is that in the Torah, which would be the first 5 books of the Bible, and the word Torah means God's teaching and instruction. In Hebrew, Torah comes from the root word yada, which means to throw a finger, like to give instruction, right? Go over here, do this thing, or this is how you accomplish this. Paul said it was written not for their sakes, but for ours. Paul said that it is a ministry of death to some and yet brings life to others. And so when we're dealing with Torah, we know that it's what the prophets complained to the Israelites about violating when God said He was going to ransack Israel and He was going to allow people to go into exile. It is what Yeshua used to argue with the Pharisees. It is what Paul kept perfectly according to Philippians. And so our misalignment with understanding it comes from traditions that don't necessarily match up with how God deals with His people. Now, I've repeated that twice, and I think it's important that you understand that the reason I have is because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this scroll. But something happens this week in this Torah portion that really, really affects me. And we're going to get into it today. But the Torah has in it a set of commanded or mandatory pilgrimages. Those mandatory pilgrimages are, of course, Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, every person who was bar mitzvahed, which I'll explain in a minute, a bar mitzvah, was required to make their presence known in the place where God would put His name for those 3 feasts. That's what the commandment says. So the feasts are required, you are required to travel to those feasts, okay? Rest of the feasts, not necessarily. Now, contained within those feasts is unleavened bread, first fruits, Feast of Trumpets, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And those all have to do with seasons. In fact, when we read in Genesis chapter 1, let the sun, moon, and stars be for signs, for seasons, for years, and for days, that word seasons is the word moedim. The word moedim is the word feasts in Leviticus 23. So translators kind of picked and chose when they wanted to translate a Hebrew word a certain way, but that Hebrew word just means one single thing. It's just an appointed time. It's a season, okay? When I talk about appointed times, I want you to think in terms of seasons in the sense of the summer, winter, fall, spring, right? Because that is kind of something that's guaranteed by the rainbow, and therefore there's a cycle to it. We're going to get into that. In context with everything, the feast day season begins with Passover, and then the Passover season lasts all the way until Pentecost. The Pentecost season then travels from Pentecost all the way to Feast of Tabernacles. And the Feast of Tabernacles ends the feast day season. Okay? So the best way I could put it to you is it's a time cycle. And in that time cycle, basically what we have going on is a process of ebb and flow, okay? We're going to get into that. But what I would like to do is begin with the flood. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up Genesis chapter 6. Give me 1 second to pull this up. Well, actually, it's probably not going to be 6. It's going to be 6. Okay. We're going to go over to here. All right. So it says, when Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the second month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in the mighty torrents of the sky, and the rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, we're going to pay attention to that 17th day of the second month. Then what we're going to do is jump over here to chapter 8, and we will go here in verse 13. Noah was now 601 years old on the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began. The flood waters had almost dried up from the earth. Noah lifted back the covering of the ark, and the surface of the ground was drying. Okay, so let's talk about this first day of the new year for a moment. In the feast day cycle, I'm sorry, not the feast day cycle, in the cycle of the year for the Israelites, Passover begins on the 14th day at evening of the first month. Well, how do we know what a first month is? Well, it was real simple. We will be watching the moons, and when the new moon came in the 12th month, we would check the barley to see whether it was in ear. The reason for this is because if the barley was in ear and it could be harvested, then the harvest was about to begin. And what you will learn about the feast days is that they're all connected to harvests. Now, two reasons why this is important. The first one is because that means that some years the barley wasn't ready, and so we would add a 13th month or a leap month. Point being is that you're not really sure of the day or hour when the feast day was actually going to fall. And that was controlled by when the harvest was going to begin, because they were all linked into the harvest. There's a few reasons for this, and it's partially listed in Deuteronomy 12, where it says, do not worship the nations. I'm sorry, do not worship me the way the nations worship their gods. You see, if we were to look at this logically, since we know that there's no such thing as an other God, since we know that there is no such thing as a God besides the God who created the heavens and the earth, the intensification of all power in the universe, then we understand that people who concluded that they should be worshiping certain things, we need to understand where they were coming from. Well, one of the places that they were coming from, and one of the things that was coming up for them, was that sometimes the rain would fall and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes the sun would shine, sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes crops would grow, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes a woman would get pregnant, sometimes she wouldn't. Well, those things that were the wouldn'ts, they considered to be the wrath of gods. And the times that were the woods were times when they had favor from the gods. And so they concluded that maybe they had to give something up. And usually that was a child sacrifice, which also kind of, since children were regarded in that state of being sacrificable or expendable, then there was always also exploitation, there was trafficking, etc. There was also human sacrifice. There were things like, for example, taking the virginity of someone while they're in the temple of these gods somehow created the life essence. There's where we get into exploitation, where people were actually bred to be sacrificed. And this was the practice of the Canaanites. So the reason why this is important is because the Father says, no, this is not how you want. I want you to keep this is not how I want you to worship me. I want you to worship me in these 3 pilgrimage feasts in which you are not to show up empty-handed. What does that mean, not to show up empty-handed? Well, that you were supposed to bring something to enjoy the feast with. Because the difference between our God and those fake gods is our God, you can't add anything to. So you can't just give up an animal and say, oh, I'm giving something to you. You couldn't give up an animal to satiate the sin requirement that was in process. In other words, you couldn't offer a sacrifice to cancel a sin that you were in. But instead, what he did is he wanted you to eat the animal. Now, there's a lot of ways we could look at this, but one of the biggest ways that we can look at this is that basically we can kind of focus our hearts and minds around the process of table fellowship, that he wanted us to enjoy food in the, and this is a horrible way to say it, but in the spirit of connectivity with him. And when I say in the spirit, what I mean is like in the sentiment. Okay. And so the concept is that sacrifices were to be eaten. And since sacrifices were to be eaten, instead of you giving up something to a god to try to get your crops to grow, you brought your harvest and you brought your lamb and you brought whatever you were bringing, and it got fried up in the temple for you, and then you went and ate it. You eat it in the sentiment of his provision, in the gratefulness. Now, in Hebrew thought, gratefulness is not, oh, thank you. Gratefulness is once your belly's full, then, oh, thank you. But if you don't fill your belly, you don't thank. The principle was That gratefulness was when you ate the food provided before you. When the gratefulness is when you eat what's set in front of you. And so in Hebrew thought, when you say thank you, that's meaningless. It's when you finish your plate. Okay. All right. So the reason why this is important is because then we can start to get our minds wrapped around the idea that the seasons were celebrations of the harvest. But now we come over to the Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles falls in the 7th month. Well, how do we know when the 7th month is? Because we got the 1st month. How do we get the 1st month? When the new moon came on the 12th month, we checked the barley and yep, okay, barley's good to go. Boom, 1st month has started. As soon as we see the visible crescent of the 1st moon of that next month, we start counting. 14 days, boom, Passover begins, feast day season begins. All the way to the Feast of Tabernacles when that ends, okay? But in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, is what we call Yom Teruah, or the blowing the trumpets. And the reason this is important is because when you blow the trumpets, then you are actually bringing in the harvest. And this harvest celebration is on the 15th day of the month. So in that way, basically, we kind of have some bookends. We have the 14th day, 15th day, either way, middle of the month, probably the full moon, right? So you get some light in the party, so to speak. Okay, now, the relevance behind this is going to come when we start diagramming. But what I want you to see is that we went from Passover, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to the 7th month, okay? And it says on the 1st day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began. So it doesn't really say that in the Hebrew that way. In fact, we can probably look at this in the Young's literal translation, get a little bit better explanation here. Because I think one of the things that we got to look at here is, and it says, and it came to pass in the 600th year, in the 1st year, in the 1st month, that is actually going to be Yom Teruah. I'm going to explain mine here in a minute. Basically, there is in Israel a commandment to practice what's called the year of Jubilees. And from that, basically what we have going on is the principle of release. So any land that was owned and you sold, you now get back. Prisoners, slaves, debts are released. And it was calculated from what's called the Shemitah, which is the 7th year. So we count 7 7-year cycles. And in that 50th year, right, 49 years, and that 50th year was Jubilees. So Jubilees is actually calculated from the Shemitah. Well, the Shemitah was calculated from Yom Kippur, which is the feast of the Day of Atonement, which is actually not a feast, it's a fast. That corresponded to the 1st day of the 7th month, which would be the new year. Why? Because the years were calculated for the year of Jubilee from Yom Kippur, not from Passover. That's why Jews technically have 2 New Years. We have the 1st month, which is the month that Passover falls in, and we have the 7th month, which is actually the civil New Year, the year that Jubilees is calculated from. Okay? Okay. So there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest one has to do with how the flood fell into the wilderness, or fell into the feast day cycle. It was right inside of the feast day cycle. I'm going to illustrate that here for you in a moment, but what I want to talk about is the second Passover. So if you were too busy to attend Passover at the pilgrimage time, then you were permitted to keep a second Passover, which fell on the 15th day of the second month. Remember, the first month is calculated as a result of the barley being near, and then we watch for the new moon. Once the new moon occurs, then we have our first month. Well, the second month, or what you could say exactly 1 moon later, 1 full moon cycle later, you were permitted to keep the second Passover. 2 days after the second Passover, the 17th of the second month, and that's when the flood began. So you could see that it got trapped between Passover and Tabernacles because it's falling in that 7th month. Okay, so now, having said that, we will go ahead and take a look at our diagram. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The first thing that we want to do here is we're just going to go ahead and we're going to put Passover. Okay, and then over here, we're going to put Tabernacles. And then right here, we're going to put Pentecost. Okay. And we'll just go ahead and put some timeline points here. Okay. And so now I want you to think about this in terms of, let's see, I'm going to go ahead and use red for this part. So from here to here, pretty near, right? Because this is about where the first day of the 7th month is. We have the flood. Okay. Now, from here to here, we are kind of in from the 1st month all the way to like the 3rd month. Okay, and then from here to here, we're from the 3rd month all the way to the 7th month. So if we were to look at this as this is Passover, and then right here we have unleavened bread. Actually, let's do that a little bit different. Here to here is unleavened bread. Okay, and then and then we have first fruits. Okay, and then over here we have, let's just do it this way. Let's do trumpets. Okay, now, when the Israelites left the land of Egypt, they began their journey into the wilderness, and they eventually arrive at Mount Sinai. Then they begin this long journey, which takes almost 40 years, and they eventually arrive at the Promised Land. Now I'm going to show you kind of how this works. But basically what we've got going on is we have this idea of them kind of somewhere in this area, we have the Red Sea, okay? But then they enter the wilderness season. They enter this season of wilderness. And they have this low point here where there's no food, no water, and they get attacked. Okay. Here, they have manna. Actually, you know what? They have manna. They have water, protection. Okay. Now, about here is where the golden calf occurs. Okay. And about here is where the waters of Meribah. I think it's actually 2 R's in one. Now, there's a second incident of Meribah, and we will go ahead and say that there's something significant that happens there where Moses is supposed to speak to the rock, not strike. Okay. But for all intents and purposes, this kind of lays out the journey of the Israelites. Now, one of the things that occurs in this process is that from this point to this point is kind of this upswing. You'll notice, in fact, let me go ahead and put it in red. You'll notice that there's this upswing of provision, protection, and instruction. And you'll notice that there's a downswing in provision, protection, instruction going from Egypt, where they had the flesh pots and the leeks and onions and garlic and minestrone soup. They had this downswing down into the wilderness where there was no food, there was no water, and they were attacked. But then there was this upswing of prosperity as they began to get ready to enter the promised land. During that time is when they get bored and decide to build the golden calf. And we're going to talk a little bit about the golden calf. But what I want to do is talk a little bit about judgment before we go any further. But that's our diagram for now. We'll get back to it. But what I want to do is kind of get our minds wrapped around the concept of judgment. Judgment is not a spanking. Judgment is not a consequence. Judgment in Hebrew thought is an equal distribution of something. Okay. Whereas the mercy of God will give to a fault, will allow the sinner to go free, will give mercy in the sense of somebody being guilty. The concept of judgment in God's eyes is actually an even distribution of treatment, of expectation, and of consequence. The flood was an equal distribution of extinction. The flood was an equal distribution of the end of all things. And in that flood, there was a preservation, yes, amen, but there was an even distribution. Unless someone was elevated. Unless someone was in a state of righteousness with the Father. Now, this got so bad that there were really actually only 8 people left in the world who practiced righteousness. What is righteousness? It is the Hebrew word for justness, and actually comes from a root word that has to do with having a pot of gold and evenly distributing it. In other words, righteousness has to do with taking care of the poor, what we call tzedakah in Hebrew, from the root word tzedak, which is the word righteous in English. Or tzedek, for example, we know Melchizedek is actually Meleki Tzedek, right? Tzedek, which is righteousness, king of righteousness. Okay. So the reason why this is important is because then we can see that the flood is an equal distribution and therefore a judgment. So let's talk a minute about the sun, and let's talk a minute about the rain. We have the sun that shines on the just and the unjust. We have the rain that falls on the just and the unjust. In fact, the only way in which the just were able to avoid the rain that fell on the unjust was that they had to create a system in which they could rise above it. There's a few reasons why this is important. Because there is this premise that somebody who is declared righteous. So let's talk a minute about that. In Hebrew thought, there is not a place in which a judgment that's made about a person is the result of an abstract opinion. What do I mean by that? I mean that a person will reflect what they really are by their actions in Hebrew thought, Hebrew lifestyle, of which we are. We're Hebrews. In fact, if you name the name of Christ, you are actually a Hebrew. We are actually encountering the premise of action. Hebrew is an action-oriented language. What does that mean? That means that the do of things, the do, the do of things, is actually the evidence or proof of the condition of the heart. Now, there's a few reasons why this is important. I think the first one is that what you'll find is that there seems to be a pattern here. If we look back at our diagram for a moment, I want you to see the flood. I want you to see this here, okay? In principle, the way that I want you to think about this is that the flood was a judgment in the sense of an even distribution. There was no distinguishing of persons. And it falls between Passover and Tabernacles. Now, there's a few reasons why this is so important, but the biggest reason is because the 120-day period in which there was a flood falls during the harvesting season. Okay. So the principle that we kind of need to get into here is basically the idea of a feast day cycle in correspondence with the harvests. Okay, and so I'm going to pull that up for you here in a moment. And I just want you to see a very specific diagram. We will take a look at that. So with this screenshot, pull up for you. Okay. So here we are looking at the Jewish festivals. And we start with the Feast of Passover. You'll notice that the Feast of Passover is actually falling during the barley harvest. And then we have the Feast of Weeks, which falls during the wheat harvest, right? The Feast of Pentecost. And that's leading into the tending of the vines, but no harvest there. The grape harvest doesn't have a feast day with it. And the first summer fruit doesn't have a feast day. The olive harvest leads into the Feast of Trumpets. So the olive harvest is actually what we're looking at for the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the reason that the Feast of Tabernacles falls when it does is because you'll notice that the next thing that's going to happen is the sowing season. Okay, so we sow grain, and then the rains come. Okay, first rains, latter rains in winter, and then we're back to the barley harvest again. There's a few reasons why this is important. The reason why this is important is because then we can observe this diagram as saying that an even distribution is actually a reaping, harvesting. That harvest is occurring throughout this entire line, okay? From Pentecost to Tabernacles is the harvest. So the flood was a harvest, okay? Meaning that the entire feast day season is actually a judgment. The entire feast day season. Now, we're talking about Christmas, Easter, Halloween, all that. No, those don't exist in God's word. They're not there. They should not be practiced, and they are not part of his plan. They're not part of his feast day cycle. Okay. Now, one of the things that's intriguing about this is the principle or the idea that if everything that falls from Passover to Tabernacles is a judgment, we need to ask, what is being evenly distributed? Well, we have the sun shining on the just and the unjust. We have the rain falling on the just and the unjust. And the only way in which someone was able to circumvent that process of flood was through an elevation. They had to rise above the waters. We're going to get to that in a minute here. But what I really want to kind of push is an understanding that basically from Passover to Tabernacles, we are reaping what we have sown. Whether that is what we have sown to the flesh or what we have sown to the spirit. We learned last week that fruit is not the direct action, but instead the reciprocation that we observe in a person. A person who has extreme favor has demonstrated a reaping of fruit that reflects that they sowed to the spirit. The function here falls into the principle or the idea of being something more than the common. Okay. So Peter has a vision, right? He has this vision of this sheet coming down from the heavens. It has all these unclean animals on it. And Yahweh says, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." And he says, "Not so, Lord, for nothing unclean or common has ever touched my lips." This is what the Father says back to him. He says, "Do not call that which I have made clean common. And so then, of course, Peter goes and he meets with Cornelius. And of course, that's where we bring the Gentiles in, because all of a sudden the Gentiles are no longer common. So let me define for you what common means. What is common? Okay. The sun shines on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. So what makes you any different? What would distinguish you as a believer in God? Well, if we're talking about fruit here, remember fruit is the reaping and sowing, then we kind of need to get our minds wrapped around the principle or the idea of a different path, a different existence, and proof of that will be fruit. Okay, so bear with me here, because this is going to become extraordinarily important because of something that is very, very disturbing in this parasha. Okay. So if that's not clear as mud, let's see if we can kind of clear things up a little bit here. So again, obviously we're dealing with a feast day cycle. So could we say that that cycle still exists to this day? Well, interestingly enough, the answer is yes, because why? Because he still has us act out these feast days. What do I mean by that? At Passover, we are to what? We are to sacrifice a lamb without blemish, whom we have observed for 5 days to verify that it is not disabled in some form. And we have become intimately acquainted with in that 5th day, which would be the 15th day. So from the 10th to the 15th day, we eat the Passover. Okay. Now, in context with that, it's very important to understand that that then is something we act out. But Yahweh says in Exodus, he says, when your children ask you, why do you do this peculiar thing? You will tell them, and he gives an explanation about, you'll tell them about what I did in Egypt. So then at the Feast of Pentecost, we have the same thing going on, right? Where we have an acting out in the performance of a certain thing, which is basically this idea of bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the harvest, right? Okay. And so when we hear those type of languages, we understand that those are references to those seasons. For example, Abel offers a lamb without blemish. That's a reference to Passover. Yeshua preaches a parable about a sower and about a harvest. That harvest, remember the general harvest, is actually the Feast of Pentecost. Let me show you and remind you again here. Okay, that is the general harvest that leads into the Feast of Pentecost. It's the harvest of wheat and of the other 7 grains. So the reason why this is important is because then we see that there's this idea of the bringing in the sheaves and that kind of stuff. And so then, of course, we have this tabernacles, right? We have this thing where we go and we build this goofy little thing that's not even a tent because it has openings in the top, and we decorate it and make it all pretty and nice, and we do things to try to make it more like a wedding canopy than anything else. It looks more like a wedding canopy. Well, intriguingly enough, that is actually something that's playing a role here. Let me show you how. So Passover season lasts from here to here. And Pentecost season lasts from here to here. Now, in those seasons, we have something special going on. And that special thing is that from Passover to Pentecost is the preparation of the bride, or the choosing of the bride. Okay. One thing that the Father set up into his process is preparation. There's a preparation day in which the Israelites go out on the sixth day and they gather twice as much as they would gather on the rest of the days of manna. Because why? The Sabbath was coming and no manna would fall on the Sabbath. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get rid of this stuff here so that we can write in here, this is the betrothal. The betrothal. Of course, you guys know that the Hebrew word for Pentecost is Shavuot, which comes from the root word to make a vow. So Shavuot is the number, Sheva is the number 7, but it doubles as the word vow because you say a vow 7 times in Hebrew, in the Hebrew lifestyle. And then in tabernacles, we have the consummation of the marriage. Okay. And so this is the preparation, betrothal, and consummation of the bride of God, right? The bride of the King. And so in purple, we'll just say that this is to do with the bride. All right. Now, the reason this is important is because what is happening in the wilderness season here? What's happening in the wilderness season there? Well, one of the things that is occurring is there is complaining going on. Okay, there's complaining going on because there's no food, no water, and because they get attacked by the Amalekites. And of course, here at the Golden Calf, we have, so let me go ahead and put our provision, protection, and instruction back in. We'll just put it over here, which is going to be manna. It's not to provision, protection, and instruction, because we know it's every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Okay. So there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason why is because this blue line going through, we're going to put as what you can see in front of you. Okay. And so in that process, when we're thinking about the preparation of the bride, she goes into the wilderness season with no food, no water, and she is attacked, right? The bride of Christ has no food, no water, has no provision, protection, or instruction. The Father pulls back his covering from her long enough for her to have the blemishes exposed that would make her undesirable. When you have no food and no water, you get cranky. And that usually ends up manifesting a very bad attitude. Okay, so we need now to talk a little bit about a very different ebb and flow. The way that we're going to do that is with green here, and I'm going to draw right through my stuff, so I apologize if this looks a little bit chaotic, but I'm going to create this other line, okay? And the way that this works is that this is elevation. Okay, I'm going to label that definitely here. This is elevation. In what way? This is spiritual elevation. And so when we are encountering the wilderness season of hunger, thirst, and a lack of protection, in which things become a little bit fearful, we have a tendency to react in a bad way. But those who are actually walking according to the Spirit are going to elevate during that time. It says something along the lines of that you be raised up. Those who wait on the Lord will be raised up. And so this is the Spirit in green. Okay. Now, what's intriguing about this is that you would think that if manna is actually the Torah, right, or the words that proceed out of the mouth of God, manna is symbolic of instruction from God or of the scriptures, then you would think that during the wilderness season, you would not have revelation. But instead, what's going on is as you become more hungry, and this includes when you fast from food and water, and when you are attacked by people. Let me talk to you a minute about something. You may not like this, but if we are to accept that there is an entity who is bent on our destruction, at this time in my life and in the life of most people I know, he doesn't need any help. We on our own destroy each other very well. Okay. And so the principle here is that most likely the attacks during the wilderness season are going to come as the result of people. People are going to lash out. Why? Because they're hungry too. They're thirsty too. Everybody's hangry, right? Okay. So from that, you can understand that attack came from the Amalekites. Even though that there was a spiritual element to the process, the Amalekites attacked Israel. A group of human beings attacked Israel. A group of human beings or a human will attack you. Why? Because they're going through it too. In fact, the whole world's going through it. Okay. So during the feast day cycle, we have no food, no water, and you're attacked, and you would think that that would result in some sort of disconnect from God. But the truth is for those who are walking in the Spirit, they are elevated. And it's a choice. It's a choice here to react correctly. So as there's this downswing coming this way, there's this upswing going this way. Now recall, there's still this concept of the preparation of the bride. So what is actually occurring with elevation? What's occurring with elevation is actually a beautification of her natural beauty, an addition or makeup, as it were, something to accent her beautiful eyes or to accent her beautiful lips. Okay. So the elevation of the bride comes in the form of a beautification, which will most likely be revelation from God, spiritual encouragement. There will be during that time a great manifestation of energy in the universe for those who respond according to the Spirit. Okay. But for those who do not respond according to the Spirit, everybody is hangry. Okay. All right. But then as we begin to head towards Pentecost, which would be the betrothal, there's a reduction occurring. And this is what I want you to see. I'm going to put it in red again to show you the downswing. The downswing. So what is the downswing? The downswing is a reduction in that spiritual process. Why? Because what is coming up is this prosperity in which you have manna, water, and protection. And what is the state of Israel at those moments? This manna is all we have to eat. We hate this manna. You don't remember when you were hungry. You don't. I promise you don't. Because you have forgotten that hunger. Let me explain. So hopefully everybody here is meat eaters. If not, I apologize. I don't want to cause offense. But let's say that we go to a really, really, really expensive steakhouse. Now, you know what's coming, right? The oven fries, steak, macaroni and cheese, right? And you know you're hungry, you're waiting, and it's taking some time, but you're patient because it's an expensive restaurant, and you know that exactly what's coming out of that kitchen is going to be divine, right? So here it comes out, it's got some buttered asparagus, some garlic butter on the steak or whatever, and it's set before you, and you can feel your mouth watering, and you start to eat it. And then you eat a little more, and pretty soon you have forgotten that anticipation. And pretty soon your conversations or your interaction or your process of eating does not involve the hunger anymore, doesn't involve the desire for it anymore. It's just a consuming. And then eventually there's a time where you pause. And there's still more steak on the plate, but you pause. Why do you pause? Because you're actually no longer hungry. And at that moment, you have completely forgotten hunger. Okay? That's how this works. And so the reason why this is so important is because when we get into the area of the golden calf, you need to know it is not a hungry people who built the golden calf. It's a fattened people. It's a people who have prospered in both protection, provision, and instruction. They received the Torah at Pentecost, right? They received the 10 Commandments, thou shalt nots, at Pentecost, and they received the opportunity to be in covenant with Yahweh. There was a betrothal made to them, and there was an opportunity for them to carry out that consummation by going into the promised land. But this golden calf incident obviously ignited in the Israelites this rebellious heart, right? Which eventually we lead from the golden calf into the rebellion of Korah. And we lead from the rebellion of Korah into the sin of Baal Peor, where the people join themselves to Baal, right? Okay. The reason why this is important is because they were betrothed. They were promised to the Father. They were promised to Yahweh. It's in Jeremiah chapter 31 through 34, it says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers when I led them by the hand out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, although I was a husband to them, a covenant which they broke. A husband to them. Now, the reason why this is so important is because, remember, there's this preparation of the bride, then there's this betrothal, and then there's this consummation, or the purple, right? And in what we see in front of us is during the wilderness season, we see no food, no water, and there's an attack from the Amalekites. This is in Exodus chapter 16 and 17. Okay, and then in the time of Pentecost, when they receive the Torah and they are given the instruction, and then Moses is called up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, and he arrives at the 40th day, and basically the people build the golden calf. Well, if you calculate in the 3 days in which they arrived at Mount Sinai and the 7 days in which they were in feast day with the Father, that's 50 days. And I can tell you tomorrow is the 50th day since Pentecost, meaning tomorrow is actually the day of the golden calf, somewhere in that area or season of our walk. Okay, there's a few reasons why this is important. But I would say that there's something that we really need to take a look at here. And that is that from elevation to this point here, let me go ahead and change that back to yellow real quick. So this point here is actually a place that is really, really important that we need to talk about. And basically what it comes down to is that the only way that you're going to get through the season of fatness or the golden calf season is humility. But there's a very specific kind of humility that the people didn't have. The humility that the people didn't have was a spiritual one. How do we know that? Because they made a god. What does that mean? That means that this point right here, if a person is walking according to the Spirit, hurts. The reason it hurts is because we saw this. We were at the top of the mountain. We were in Revelation during the wilderness season when everybody else was complaining about how starving they were. We were grateful to be fasting. When everybody was complaining about being attacked, we were grateful to learn war. But as we moved into Pentecost and moved into the season of fatness, which may not equate to actual physical prosperity per se, but can equate to simple instruction from God. It can equate to maybe you get a few more hours at work. I don't know what all it equates to. But I do know that when you get to here, you can't hear God. Now, the reason for that is because you are either going to make your own God and hear what you want to hear, or you are going to wait, just like you did during the wilderness season. It hurts because it feels like you might be doing something wrong. It feels, like the rest of life just kind of, it seems to be going really well. But in your spiritual life, you're like, man, something's just not right. And it feels not right. And that's because the Spirit is humbling you so that you do not build a golden calf. So what's interesting is this, let's do it in dark blue. This moment here, this moment here is actually the season of fatness for this realm of the Spirit. And this moment here is actually the season of wilderness for the person who's walking in the Spirit. Now, there's only one way in which you are in the Spirit to begin with, and that is if you are His. We need to talk a bit about this. There were two types of people that came out of the nation of Israel who came out of Egypt. There was the one who was willing to wait on the Lord when things got rough. the one who was willing to go into the promised land when they were supposed to, the one who was grateful for the opportunity to fast, grateful for the opportunity to learn more, the one who was willing to accept the moments of dryness in which they didn't receive any communication from God, any revelation from God, when it seemed as though there was nothing coming their way that would indicate that they were His. Maybe they felt like they didn't have that witness inside them anymore. Of course, we know in Romans 8 it says the Spirit witnesses with our spirit that we're the children of God. Maybe they are not feeling that. But there's two types of people. There was the people who complained, and there was the people who didn't complain. And the people who complained ended up falling dead in the desert. Now, there are a number of incidents that occur after the people refuse to go into the promised land. Now, we have already concluded through other studies that the season of the golden calf is the time when the people refuse to go into the promised land. Very near that time period, a year later after the golden calf. So as a result of that, I think it's very important to kind of understand that they were coming back around in the feast day cycle. Okay. But after they are not allowed to go into the promised land because they chose not to go, then they go into a series of incidents. The first incident is, of course, the sin of Korah, in which Korah is really not okay with what has happened with the promised land and all that, and decides to rebel against Moses. But there's another incident that occurs, and that is that Aaron and Miriam speak against Moses, and yet again, there is this premise or this principle that they are in error. Right now, I believe that precedes them going to the promised land, but it's still an important incident. Then we have, after the not going into the promised land, we also have the people complaining about God killing the 250 prophets during the rebellion of Korah, in which they had turned against Yahweh. And there was 14,700, I believe, who fell in that. And of course, we have the golden calf, which of course was the 3,000 people died in the golden calf. Okay. 14,500 people died in the incident of Korah. And then we have another 24,000 people dying in the sin of the Al Peor. So when we look at this, I think one of the things that we kind of need to get our minds wrapped around is the principle that these incidents in which they died were where they had rebelled or they had sinned against God in a severe manner. But something interesting happens in this parasha, and it kind of was a sobering moment for me as I realized it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump over to that and take a look at that situation. And so just so you know, our parasha, or our Torah section, is actually Numbers chapter 30, verse 1, all the way to chapter 36. But specifically, I want to be in Numbers 33. And we're going to go ahead and put this in a readable version and find it to examine some things we can. But here's how it goes. So this is the route the Israelites followed as they marched out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At Yahweh's direction, Moses kept a written record of their progress. These are the stages of their march, identified by the different places where they stopped along the way. They set out from Ramses in early spring on the 15th day of the first month, on the morning after the first Passover celebration. The people of Israel left defiantly, in full view of the Egyptians. Meanwhile, the Egyptians were burying their firstborn sons, whom Yahweh had killed the night before, and Yahweh had defeated the gods of Egypt that night with great acts of judgment. So I want you to see that it says right here, they set out from the city of Ramses. And then down here it says, after leaving Ramses, the Israelites set up at Sukkot. Now, getting back to this, verse 3 through 4 is an incident. Okay, a mention of an incident. Then we have locations. Sukkot to Etam, Etam to Pehir Yerot, opposite Baal Zebulun, and camped near Migdal. Okay, then they left Pehir Yerot and crossed the Red Sea. There's an incident. Crossed the Red Sea into the wilderness beyond. They traveled for 3 days in the Etam wilderness at Mara. Okay, now you see there's an incident, Red Sea, but then we're back to locations. Mara, encamped at Elam, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palms. Okay, so there's another mention of something other than the location. Then they left Elam and camped at the Red Sea. They left the Red Sea and camped in the wilderness of Sin. They left the wilderness of Sin and camped at Dovka. They left Dovka and camped at Alush, and they left Alush and camped at Rephidim. At Rephidim, there was no water for the people to drink. There's an incident. They left Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. No incident mentioned. No mention of the giving of the 10 Commandments. No mention of the people making a covenant with Yahweh. No mention of anything to do with Sinai. They left the wilderness of Sinai and camped at Kibrat Ha'avata. Okay? They left Kibrat Ha'avata and camped at Hatzerot. They left Hatzerot and camped at Rithma. No incident mentioned. They left Rithma and camped at Rimmon Perez, Libna, Risa, Kehithla, Atha, and Mount Shefer to Heradah to Machelot, and camped at Talath to Terah to Mithka to Hashmona to Matzorot to Bnei Jachan to Hor Hagigad to Jaffa to Aborna, from Aborna to Ezion Geber, and camped at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Kadesh to Mount Hor. Who died on Mount Hor? Aaron. Incident mentioned at the border of Edom, right? They were there at the foot of Mount Hor. Aaron the priest was directed by Yahweh to go up the mountain. There he died. This happened in midsummer on the first day of the 5th month of the 14th year. You know when that was? Golden calf. Okay, I'll keep going. Of the 40th year after Israel's departure from Egypt. Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. At that time, the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev in the land of Canaan, heard that the people of Israel were approaching his land. Meanwhile, the Israelites left Mount Hor and went to Zalmunna. Notice that incident's mentioned there. Something about the king hearing that he had heard that they were coming, right? Left Zalmunna, went to Punon to Obot camped at Lai Abiram on the border of Moab. They left Lai Abiram and went to Dibigon Gad to Almon Dibethaim, left Almon Dibethaim and camped in the mountains east of the river near what? Mount Nebo. They left the mountains east of the river and camped on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River, across from Jericho. Along the Jordan River, they camped from Jeshimot as far as the meadows of Acacia on the plains of Moab. While they were camped near the Jordan River on the plains of Moab, opposite Jericho, Yahweh said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the people living there. You must destroy all their carved molten images. Do you see this? What is Mount Nebo? It's where Moses died. Okay. You're probably like, what is this dude? Why is this dude reading all these locations? Because I wanted to go through the whole list so that you could see there's something missing. The golden calf is missing. The covenant is missing. The betrothal is missing. The rebellion of Korach is missing. The copper snake is missing. The Baal Peor, Midian, Cosby, Phinehas, all of that is missing. But Aaron dying is there, and Moses at Mount Nebo is there. They leave Ramses and they talk about the Egyptians burying their dead, which is not mentioned in the Exodus, but is mentioned here. So details were important, but there's details missing. In fact, there's 40 years missing. I propose to you that this is the book, that they've been blotted out of the book, that those incidents caused them to be blotted out of the official record. Now, we get it as a narrative in Torah, but I believe Yahweh made it this way on purpose, as a warning, that how you react to the feast day season will definitely reflect your relationship and your process with God. People come to Yeshua at the end of time and they say, Lord, we have cast out demons in your name. We have worked miracles in your name. We have prophesied in your name. Now, I want you for a moment to stop thinking like a Christian. I want you to think like a Hebrew. The Hebrew is going to look at Torah and say, okay, if they're standing before the intensification of all power in the universe during judgment, are they going to lie? No. So what does that mean? Well, we've got to go, I prophesied in your name. Now, according to Scripture, if you don't prophesy in the name of God and prophecy presumptuously, you will die. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 20. If you prophesy and then say, let's go after other gods, you will die. Which means what? They were not false prophets. These people actually were giving prophecy, and it was coming to pass in the name of Yeshua. Working miracles. We are not a nation who believes in God. But the entire nation of Israel, as an entire citizenry, believed in God during Yeshua's time. And miracles were a part of that process. They're not a part of the process today, because we are not a people who believes in God. So in that process, it was common ground for a miracle to occur. When it didn't, there was reason for that. It was not real. So we worked miracles in your name. Casting out of demons. That's either done or not done. And if it's not done, then they didn't actually cast out demons in his name. So these actions that they do as some other ability than a relationship with Christ. Why? Because he says, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. And of course, he's speaking during the Sermon on the Mount, which at the end of that, the people walk away going, he teaches with more authority than our teachers. They didn't know who he was. And so when he's speaking to them, this is what we know. They were Jews. There weren't Gentiles in that crowd. This was just Jewish people. And they were hearing a Jewish message. Well, what's the Jewish message? Lawlessness is a violation of Torah. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4 is a violation of Torah. Sin is a violation of the law. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. So when he says, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness, he was not talking about somebody who has a rebellious heart and who is maybe a criminal or somebody who doesn't like to follow the rules. He's talking about somebody who refuses to keep Torah. The prophets complained about what? About people not keeping Torah. Isaiah 66 says that Yeshua is coming back with a strong rebuke for those who, what? Eat swine's flesh, have sex with a woman during her menstrual period, and who worship or who go after other gods. Now, the principle here is that those people who he didn't know were not in his book. So if not being obedient to Torah is evidence that you are not in his book, I'm going to let you figure out what that means for you in your own heart. But I will throw out there that when we get back to this right here only occurs as a result of those who are his, who are in his book. What is the golden calf? Really, actually. It was a lack of willingness to wait on the Father, not on Moses. They said, as for this Moses, we don't know where he went. But what did they say to Aaron? They say, make us a God that we may worship him. Right? So, who or what is a God? Because what do we know? This is what we know. It doesn't say in the Hebrew, in the commandments, thou shalt not have any other gods before me, and then him say, false gods. He said, you shall not have any other gods before me, as in real gods. You say, well, wait a minute. You just got through saying there's no such thing as another God. What I said is that the people who worship the other gods are not actually worshiping something, because they don't exist. There is actually no life in the statue of Baal where they're putting a food offering. Instead, there are other gods. Those other gods are mentioned in Psalm 82, in which it says, you are all gods. Yeshua is in the temple. No, he wasn't in the temple. He was out in the wilderness, I believe. And he was talking to some Pharisees and talking to some other people. And during that time, he says, I and the Father are one. This is actually in John chapter 10. I think actually it was in the temple. It was during the Feast of Dedication or during Hanukkah. And I want you to notice that Hanukkah was being practiced, even though it's a traditional feast. So at any rate, basically, he's in Jerusalem during Hanukkah, and he says, I and the Father are one. And here's the intriguing part. They pick up stones to stone him. He says, why are you going to stone me? What works have I done that you think that I should be stoned? And they say, it's not because of your works, it's because of your mouth. You make yourself equal to God. And he says this, he says, is it not written in Scripture that we are all gods? Now, NASB translates that verse in Psalm 82 as judges. there's other verses there's other versions that translate it as elders. No, Yeshua translated it as gods, theos in the Greek. Okay, and so as a result of that, I want to propose to you that the golden calf is actually spiritual pride. I want to propose to you that the golden calf that's being created, the golden calf that comes during this season, is when we stop getting revelation from God and we make up our own stuff. God told me to do this. God gave me instruction to tell you this. God says that, or I have this feeling, or I hear that we're supposed to do this, that I'm supposed to wear purple today, blah, blah. No. During this season, if you are walking in the Spirit, you will not be hearing from Him. Now, I'm talking about deep revelation here, right? I'm not talking about praying to God for guidance or instruction on whether you should get a job or not, and He opens the doors or closes the doors. He's going to still answer your prayers. He's kind of a multitasker in that way. But this is a season of hunger for those who walk according to the Spirit. Why? Because you're coming to the border of the promised land. And you're going to walk in there and take it. Now, when is that? Of course, that is the fall feast, and we can dwell on that on another day. But the point in the plan here is to understand that He has this cycle that creates an ebb and flow. I'm going to show you guys a different cycle here in a minute. But what I really want you to see here is that if you are in His book, you will respond accordingly. Now, let's talk a minute about Moses and Aaron. Aaron dies on the eve of the golden calf, 40 some years later, right? But he dies on that eve. It's almost as if his death was appointed at that time. Okay. Moses dies on the eve of Passover. Okay. Because the next thing that's going to happen after if Moses dies at Mount Nebo, Joshua is going to cross the Jordan. We don't get that until the end of Deuteronomy, until Joshua. You get my point. Now, the reason why that is relevant is because when we look at the concept of this ebb and flow, we see that there is in front of us distress. And then we see in front of us prosperity. But in the Spirit, we see elevation. And in the Spirit, we see humility. That humility is real simple. For those of you who are in deep relationship with the Father, it will be like a wilderness season. It will be hard. It will be difficult to get through. Many, many people during this time are going to fall into a spiritual disintegration. But that again is to expose something in the bride. That is to show something about, remember how the wilderness season was about exposing blemishes and accenting beauty. Now picture that happening in the supernatural realm. Picture that happening as a spiritual process. Okay? Like I said, I have not gotten a greater confirmation in which experience itself showed me this week. I did have other people ask questions that would pertain to it, but this is exactly what was asked: is where's the golden calf? Where's the the sins of Korach. Where's the sins of the Baal Peor? It goes straight from Sinai all the way to Nebo and doesn't even mention 40 years. Okay, until we get down to Aaron, of course. But the principle is that basically what we're working with here is this idea of how you respond, right? So this season will be deceptive. What do I mean by that? You will not necessarily get instruction from Father. You will start to manufacture it if you are not cognizant of Spirit. If you're not cognizant of the supernatural energy present within you that has reduced itself, then you will create your own. And once you create that golden calf, once you have placed another God before Elohim, before Yahweh, before the Creator, intensification of all power in the universe. In other words, you have become your own God by manufacturing your own prophecies, manufacturing your own desires, manufacturing your own attitude about how things should be in the world. When he has not given you that revelation, you have spoken presumptuously, that prophet shall die. So the next time that you say, I feel like God is telling me this, I want you to think about the danger. The next time that you are coming into the season of fatness after the golden calf, or I'm sorry, not after the golden calf, after Pentecost, as there's an upswing in prosperity, perhaps it's financial, perhaps it is relational, perhaps it is, some sort of thing that you've been praying for a while and it's coming to pass, whatever it may be, rest assured that's not what's going on in the supernatural realm right now. In the supernatural realm, you have entered into what we call the expansion. And here's how it works. There is an expansion and contraction of the vessel of reception. Okay. But to understand that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at this other, we're going to take a look at this other diagram real quick. Okay. So let's see, let's start with our, that's a whole circle. We'll try that again. Did you know if you draw a circle in the opposite direction, you think you should, it would be a prettier circle? All right, so here we have, and of course you guys know this by now, we have winter, which is the season of death, right? The seed is sown to the ground and it must die before it sprouts, right? That's what Yeshua said. And we have spring. Spring spelled with a T. Spring. Emphasis that. We have summer, right? Summer, which is cultivation and all that, but mainly maturation. Equates to maturity. And then over here in fall, everything starts to kind of go into entropy, which is basically a settling. And a settling and kind of an order. Everything's coming into order, everything's settling, and it's getting colder, of course. Okay. And of course, here in this season of death is the result of a spiritual death that occurred as a result of sin. But then we have these in-betweens, right? And so here, this going from death to life is the result of obedience. Okay. Going from life into maturity, you have kind of the concept of that there's some growth going to occur here, but we need to also know that this is the season of complacency. Right? Going from here to here, we know that this is disobedience. Disobedience, and then going from here back to here, we have basically this season of possession. Okay, and the way that this works has to do with the state in which you're operating. And so in its simplicity, when you are in the wintertime, you're hungry for God again. You're longing for that harvest. You are experiencing those moments of shame and guilt as a result of what has occurred here, which we will get to in a moment. At this point, between this point is the season of repentance. Okay. Season of repentance doesn't necessarily equate to a fully obedient person, but can also equate to a person who is just done with the darkness. Let me explain why. So what is the big deal here? Complacency, where we have the golden calf, right? Complacency, where we have the golden calf, which is praise. What's interesting is that our transition from winter into spring is where we encounter Passover, right? So Passover is basically this time of true obedience to the Father. But as we go through this season, one of the things that we have going on is this principle of complacency, where we're not hungry anymore. See, here, this obedience this is right after we have been in the realm of death. Let's talk about the realm of death real quick. Okay. So the way this works is Moses stands before the people, holds up the scroll, and he says, behold, I call heaven and earth as witness against you. Holds it up, says, here is the covenant, right? Here's the covenant. I'll turn it this way so you can see it. Here's the covenant. Then he says, I set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you might live. He sets that before them, calls heaven and earth as witness, that he's giving them an opportunity to choose life. So if we look at the idea that the curse is basically an operation of lack and decrease, and life is an operation of abundance, then we need to look at the sun shining on the just and the unjust again. We need to look at this concept of elevation. We need to look at all these things, because what we're going to find is that if you have the sun shining on you and the rain falling on you, that's an even distribution, okay? But if you have more, then you demonstrate that you have been obedient. Now, the obedience itself is not the fruit. The reaping is the fruit, the proof that you have been obedient. And so the reaping, of course, occurs between Passover and Feast of Tabernacles. The reason that's important is because then we start to get into the principle or the idea that any reduction in the sun shining on the just and the unjust is a demonstration of disobedience. But we need to talk a minute about accountability. Now, that is a horrible word in the English language that basically equates to, I'm going to tell on you because you have been bad. Or I'm going to tell you that you have been bad. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about accounting. What I'm talking about is a chart of accounts. I'm talking about stewardship and keeping track of something, okay? So when we're talking about accountability, the way that I want you to think about this is that you cannot take inventory of something that is not in the storehouse. What does that mean? That means that you cannot identify someone who's obedient or disobedient if they do not have Torah in their lives first. Now, if a person sits down in front of me and they're eating a meal and it contains pork, and they offer me some and I say, no, thank you, I don't eat pork. And they say, oh, well, you know that the law has been done away with, you can eat pork. I say, well, actually, no, that's actually a misunderstanding of what actually is going on in the realm of Hebrew and Israelite understanding and the sect of the way. And Paul, who practiced the law until he died, never indicated that. And of course, there's way more that goes into that argument, but the point is now they have heard Torah. Now, the deal is that as long as your heart is hardened to it, you can't hear it. So the warehouse is closed. There's nothing going in, right? You can't take inventory. You cannot give an accounting of it being written upon your heart because it is dormant as a result of us having a hard heart towards it. But as our heart begins to soften and people speak it, it starts to come alive in us. And therefore we are accountable to it, and our conscience accuses or defends us. This is what it says in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. It says, if a Gentile who does the things of the law demonstrates themselves, who does not have the law, does the things of the law, they demonstrate themselves to be a law unto themselves, and that the law is written on their hearts, their conscience accusing or defending them. In that context, then, we understand that a person's conscience can't accuse or defend them if they can't hear the Torah written on their heart. Okay? But that doesn't always jive. What's my point? My point is that obedience and disobedience can only be accounted for if there is a knowledge of Torah. In other words, if someone has not been told that Yeshua is coming back with a strong rebuke for those who eat swine's flesh, Isaiah 66, verse 17, then you don't know. That's innocence, as it were, or common. Okay? So the principle is anything that's raised up above the even distribution is his. And anything that's raised up above the distribution will be abundance in the spiritual realm, abundance in the natural realm. And so as a result of that, you will know when someone's been obedient. So this part right here is actually about that accounting. It's about that warehouse having the ability to put something in it. If the warehouse is closed, it doesn't matter. What's my point? My point is that his people who are called by his name are the ones who have to repent. It doesn't tell the world to repent. It says, if my people who are called by my name will seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, right, and pray, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. It is the obedient ones. Right? It is the obedient ones. So now let's get into this thought process. So the principle is that the obedience is actually as a result of the hungers. The hungers is the filling or the not filling, right? Okay, but then we get into the principle of complacency, where we don't have the hunger anymore. Now, if we don't respond correctly, then we do have this golden calf concept going on, but something worse is going to occur with the nation of Israel. What is that? That is the nation of Midian. The nation of Midian. So the nation of Midian offers to the nation of Israel an opportunity for them to have intermarriage and sexual relations with their women, on the condition that they make just a little sacrifice to Baal and join themselves to Baal. So Israel buys into this concept, and so this is what we call infestation, right? This is infestation. Then all of a sudden over here, we have a concept of oppression, where the Midianites turn on the Israelites and they actually oppress them. Okay. Now, why is this important? Because then eventually they take possession of them. Then they cry out, and Yahweh sends a deliverer, or a Yeshua. That's what Yeshua means in Hebrew, is to snatch away from danger violently. Okay, and so they send a Yeshua, and then Yeshua delivers them from the death, and they start to move back into life in obedience. And then eventually they become complacent again, and a new nation comes along offering another kind of God, and that another kind of God then turns into oppression, which leads back to possession again. This is the concept of demonic infestation, oppression, and possession. Why? Because according to Deuteronomy 32, those gods that they're supposedly worshiping were not gods, but were demons. And so it's not a matter of somebody inhabiting a human body, but instead the ownership or jurisdiction that that demon has over the person. That's why when the person approaches Yeshua and says, "What have I to do with you, son of David?" or have you come to torment us before it's time? Why? Because their jurisdiction was not released yet. Okay, the reason I share this with you is because I want you to understand the season in which some of these things are occurring, but I also want you to see something very, very important. And that is, if the golden calf is a creation of another God, then these nations here, in fact, let's change the color. These nations that do this here are actually other gods as well. What do I mean by that? They have already dismissed themselves from what's going on in the supernatural realm. Why? Because we know the sun shines on the just and the unjust. Getting back to our concept of the flood, what do we have? If we're getting back to our concept of the flood, we have an even distribution. The sun shines on the just and the unjust. It's only those who actually were in the ark who were elevated. And as the waters receded, then there was a returning to the land. Okay, so they were raised up into the heavens. And here they are on the land. So the humility and non-humility of this concept then comes in the form of what? The proper response to the season. Because what did Israel do when they violated the rules of the golden calf? Adultery. But what's interesting is the way that they committed adultery is they made a new covering. They made a new God to worship. So the principle that I really want to kind of get across here, the communication that I want to bring to the table, is the principle of how you can fall into this. I'm not trying to say that somebody's in the book or out of the book. That's between you and God. But I can tell you an evidence that you are possibly not in the book is your behavior during these feast days, your way in which you deal with it. Now, if you were Christmas, Easter, Halloween, and haven't even touched Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles, then there's no discussion to be had. But if you are actually walking out the feast days of Israel and you are accountable to Torah in the way in which you are supposed to be if you name the name of Christ, whether you be grafted in or whether you be a bloodline Jew, that's a different story. You're accountable to these things. And of course, that's one of the arguments that Paul makes in Romans chapter 2. He's like, hey, you guys, you claim to be teachers of Torah, but you do these other things, and therefore you render your circumcision annulled. You disqualify yourself from the covenant. And this Gentile who doesn't know Torah comes along and does it, and he shows himself to be circumcised. Therefore, circumcision is that of the heart, and he is a Jew who is one inwardly. So the principle that I want you to go away with is that if you don't see the fruit of prophecy, of miracles, of abundance, then ask yourself what is going on. Second, no one, okay, I'm just going to put this out here. No one in Scripture is ever told to go tell somebody something who's in order. If your conscience is clear and somebody comes to you and says, well, God told me to tell you this, that's golden calf. If you feel that you have walked in obedience and you feel like you're not hearing from the Father and you're frustrated, and you feel like your prayers are not being answered, check your sin list first. But if that's covered, check and see if there's an instruction you haven't carried out, because he will pause. He won't give you more instruction until you carry out the instruction you're given. If all of those are in place and there's still a silence, then I would say that you're probably walking in the Spirit. And that can be a very scary thing to not feel like you are. So keep that in mind, because the alternative is a golden calf in which all of a sudden we make a god for ourselves. Well, we're going to either create a false idol that we worship, or we're going to elevate ourselves into a position of prophecy, instruction, ministry, whatever, without ever being called. Okay. All right. So from that perspective, then we'll go ahead and I will close up the YouTube channel. For those of you who are on YouTube, Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next week.